How is it possible that you can round up 3 players of 3 vastly different skill levels and each one will view a job in a completely different light, even if they have the same preferences and job style? The extremely casual perspective of a job tends to be a completely different universe to the, Midcore or so perspective, and yet still is also completely different to the Parser's perspective, at least at times. In this video, I want to shine a light on how these 3 perspectives can be so different, and I will do so by proposing different examples of jobs and their rotations. To begin though, we have to make some ground rules. The extremely casual player I am posing as an example here is the kind of player that views openers as something that is only needed when doing really hard content, and views it as completely unnecessary outside of that. Some of these kinds of players might even view openers as excessive outright in general, under the assumption that enraged timers are never so strict that you can't make it by just trying your best. I will probably simply refer to this player as the casual player from now on. The midcore player is the kind of player who does make an effort to get the opener right, but after that, as long as things get used on cooldown and they somewhat stick to a meaningful optimal rotation, if things slide a bit, that's okay. They are probably more excited to see raid buffs line up together than expecting it outright. The Parser player is the kind of player who might feel like a pull in a savage boss fight is pointless if their biggest attack didn't actually direct crit, or if someone dies at all during the encounter. They of course will do the best opener and will play their rotation perfectly optimally, and anything less might be viewed as a waste of time. Just to be clear, I'm not posing these examples to try and dunk on anyone or claim that something in particular is easy or hard, but simply to try and generate some perspectives. Now, with those ground rules set, let's take some examples. The jobs I want to bring up are Machinist, Dark Knight, Gunbreaker, Samurai, and Astrologian. Let's start with Machinist. This job turns out to have a handful of different openers nowadays, but a lot of players will probably simply focus on the delayed tools opener. However, a casual player, especially in more casual content especially, will probably simply faceplant on their 3 tools immediately and then figure out what they do about wildfire afterwards. This is extremely easy of course, and 2 minutes later, whether any of this lines up with raid buffs is completely irrelevant, because in the type of content this player participates in, it is possibly a surprise if raid buffs line up in the first place, and given that Machinist itself doesn't really have any buffs, there's very little to plan around. A midcore player is more likely to perform whichever opener, let's say the delayed tools opener in this case, and then try to stick to whatever plan the rotation relies on. For example, a specific time for the odd minute queen, and overcapping 5 heat right around the 2-minute mark. But eventually they might deviate by accident and simply freestyle it from there. For the Parser, that mistake is grounds for a wipe. The fact that the midcore player may realize that they make a mistake at some point and so have to freestyle it means they are more likely to evaluate Machinist as a difficult job. On the other hand, the casual player doesn't even consider that there would be anything to plan around, meaning that it is very easy to just faceplant on the 3 tools into barrel stabilizer wildfire and just, click things when they're available. And the thing is, that is good enough for most content, so you could argue they are both right. To a Parser, I would imagine that Machinist might be considered hard because you have a specific correct answer for most of your GZDs and a pretty lengthy pipeline to plan around. However, it is probably easier to determine whether it is hard by comparing to other jobs, and I do imagine the Parser would find Bard harder simply because it isn't as predictable as Machinist, meaning that Machinist is considered easier for being so strict, because at least you know what you need to do once you have memorized it. This way, I hope you can see already how 3 vastly different players can view a specific job in 3 completely different lights. Next, I want to talk about Dark Knight and Gunbreaker. A casual player might be, for example, the kind of Gunbreaker to use Rough Divide to pull with, and then No Mercy immediately, and just go through all of their cooldowns from there. Simply using everything when you have it in this way will, for the most part, land your big damage numbers in No Mercy naturally, meaning that a casual player will be somewhat accurate. Naturally, not all will be this good. A midcore player would focus on a proper opener and then go from there. The thing is that compared to Machinist, Gunbreaker is only heavily impacted on their bursts if there is a severe amount of downtime in a fight, and sometimes they can compensate with AoE combos, for example. That is to say that the difference between a Parser and a Midcore Gunbreaker may be more in relation to how much you care about your big attacks actually critting and such. The reason why it is a lot more commonly accepted that Gunbreaker is considered a very hard tank to play might be because even the casual player realizes that they might be making mistakes, since No Mercy and all of their cooldowns line up so well that it is hard to ignore. On the other hand, once you've gotten down the No Mercy window and learned how to deal with the downtimes between, there is a limit to how much more complex Gunbreaker can get. Compare this to Dark Knight, which technically doesn't have a rate buff or a temporary damage buff, so a casual player would simply phase roll on all of the cooldowns, and that would be fine, using resources as they are available instead of stockpiling. A Midcore player, on the other hand, might do a proper opener and might stockpile resources a bit for their 2-minute burst. By doing a proper opener, Dark Knight's cooldowns will naturally line up with the 2-minute burst for the most part too. However, the Parser in this case would care about bringing as many resources as possible into the burst, which can include Dark Arts from TBN, which relies on knowing when you need to do that beforehand. The Dark Knight needs to take care of knowing when they can set up Dark Arts leading up to a burst, and still have all of the MP possible for the burst. If you're sitting there thinking, that's one Edge of Shadow, it can hardly mean anything, you would be right. However, if you are passing, it isn't about being good or great, it is about being the best, which requires you to be perfect. This comparison of having a complex optimization that is generally considered excessive, as well as more casual players perhaps being entirely oblivious to rate buff windows, makes it pretty common for players to consider Dark Knight extremely easy to play, despite the potential optimizations it can have. That is not me trying to claim that Dark Knight is specifically harder or easier than Gunbreaker, but simply trying to highlight that they both can be hard and easy, depending on what you find hard and easy, and also what kind of perspective to look at the jobs with. Samurai is actually another great example of the exact same problem. Samurai has no rate buffs or any temporary damage buffs of their own, so looking at all the damage buttons you have as a Samurai, from a casual perspective, it doesn't actually matter when you use them as long as you do. Keeping uptime on Higanbana is more important than when you keep uptime on Higanbana. A Midcore player might use an optimal opener and might even subscribe to using the looping rotations to make sure things align naturally. However, not all of them will try very hard to find their way back to the looping rotation if something causes them to drift off. Some may choose to freestyle the rest of the pull, and some may find a suboptimal way to get back into the loop, but there is typically an optimal way to go about it depending on your specific case. That is, of course, what the Parser will do. The Parser might not even always use the looping rotation if the specific encounter happens to come packaged with enough downtime that they know when everything has to be done to line up. Now, the thing is that the difference between the looping rotation and just freestyling it, once you're using an opener, isn't too big. Although not looping means you might drift your GCD slowly into an awkward position compared to the 2-minute burst. However, if you are trying to do the looping rotation and the bursts exactly on time and everything, that would make Samurai feel more difficult than if you didn't. This leads a lot of players to believe that Samurai is a trivially easy job, when the difference between a Samurai that does respect burst windows and one who doesn't is very significant, and the difficulty difference between the two is also significant. Finally, Astrologian. And this might just be the perfect job to illustrate the difference between the three perspectives. A casual Astrologian will probably play cards as they get them, and only when they aren't busy with other stuff. If you've ever had an Astrologian in casual content that seems to very randomly use their divination and even card plays, this is probably the reason. A Midcore Astrologian player is more likely to at least attempt the optimal card bursts in the opener and every 2 minutes, and if nothing else, they are at least using their cards as best they can. The Parser, though, will probably keep track of exactly what job should get a card at specific intervals. They also always play exactly 1 card on the odd minute and exactly 3 on the even minute. Playing the card on the wrong person could be grounds for a wipe, depending on how excessively optimized the Parser group is at that time. However, the perspective of Astrologian being extremely high APM in their bursts can be completely lost on a more casual player that doesn't care about burst windows, as they can easily spread out their cards to when there is decent space for it. They don't have to use lightspeed to play their cards, because they play them when there is nothing more important to do anyway. However, that aspect of having to manage cards still makes Astrologian appear more difficult than the other healers in some capacity, which tends to make it compete with Scholar for being hardest due to Scholar's pet mechanics. The interesting thing between these 5 jobs I listed is that Machinist is the kind of job that either is considered nearly trivial to play or very hard, and usually not anywhere between. Dark Knight is generally viewed as very easy, or harder than Warrior and Paladin. Gunbreaker is typically viewed as the hardest tank, or for some players it is very easy. And Samurai is often considered effectively trivial, or at least mediocre in difficulty, often considered easier than, say, Monk. And finally, Astrologian is typically considered the hardest healer to play, unless the specific player finds pet management very hard. And often, if any other healer is considered harder than Astrologian to them, it is often either, at least to my knowledge, because they don't care about burst windows, meaning the cards aren't the problem, or because they do care, and are so experienced with Astrologian that the different toolkits are simply what is making the difference. Anyway, this video was not an attempt to quote-unquote dunk on anyone or make a case for whether a job is easy or hard, but simply an attempt at highlighting how or why different sections of the player base can see a job in completely different lights, depending on their perspective. There's always the possibility that someone finds a job very easy simply because the kind of toolkit the job has perfectly matches with the kind of toolkit the player would be good at handling. Or in contrast, that a job is considered extremely difficult because they just don't get it. This is something I have heard a lot, actually. Maybe you have some other examples, or maybe you feel that I am completely off or wrong, or forgot something in these examples, or maybe some stories of players you've met that either they completely misunderstood something about a job, or maybe you learned something from someone else by hearing a second opinion on a job you thought you knew. Either way, I would love to hear your opinion in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, back in Heavensward, Black Mage's Enochian mechanic was so convoluted that there was a genuine alternative rotation some Black Mages used that didn't actually make use of Enochian. While it was a significant damage loss to do that, it probably speaks volumes about a job if it has a mechanic so complicated that people simply gave up trying to use it, don't you think?